This recording is going to cover the first aspect of cardiovascular regulatory mechanisms. Specifically, it will discuss the control of blood flow, local control plus extrinsic control, and also will address the acute control of blood flow versus long-term control of blood flow. And now, as a reminder, the flow equation is what you see here. It's related to the change in pressure over change in resistance. And as a reminder from previous discussions is that the major way that we're going to alter blood flow is by changing resistance, because that we could be more specific at altering blood flow in specific regions. If we altered pressure, this would have more systemic effects. We don't want to have to increase pressure, increase flow, say, to your legs while you're exercising, because you'd have to increase pressure everywhere. Instead, we rather alter vascular resistance in specific areas and affect blood flow. Now, as you've seen in this picture illustrating the changes in blood flow in different areas of the body, say during exercise, again, you're seeing a huge increase in flow in skeletal muscle because the skeletal muscle is going to be more metabolically active. It's going to need more blood flow. You see more blood flow to the skin because that's going to be important in temperature regulation. But what you're going to see is you see reductions in flow in, say, the kidney and the abdomen region. Now, you do see increases in blood flow to the heart because the heart's working more to be able to pump out that blood. So how do we do this? How can we increase flow in one place but decrease flow in the other? So what we're going to do is look at some mechanisms by which we control blood flow. We're specifically addressing the acute changes in blood flow, not long-term, short-term changes in blood flow. So the first thing we'll look at is the effects of vasodilators. So vasodilators will increase flow. I'm going to use Q for flow. They increase flow due to a decrease, and I'll use the arrow down, to a decrease in resistance. The examples that you see we're going to address almost all of them, probably all of them, is there's one theory behind the local control of blood flow, and they call it the metabolic byproduct theory. So in essence, metabolic byproducts act as vasodilators. They relax vascular smooth muscle, which would increase the diameter of that vessel, which increases flow. So if you think about that carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions, those would definitely be metabolic byproducts. When tissue is more metabolically active, they produce more carbon dioxide. The hydrogen ions would be a byproduct of lactic acid production. Both are metabolic byproducts. There also, think about adenosine. Adenosine is a breakdown product of ATP. So if I take ATP and I break it down, initially get ADP plus an inorganic phosphate. But in some instances, we can break that all the way down to adenosine, and adenosine is a very potent vasodilator. Now, the decrease in oxygen that you see, so if we have a decrease in oxygen, think about that making sense in regards to, say, exercise. If tissues are more metabolically active, they require more oxygen, and a reduction of oxygen would be like, oh, I need more blood flow. So a reduction of oxygen would result in vasodilation. And that's actually linked to another theory for local control of blood flow, and they refer to it as the oxygen demand theory. Now, nitric oxide is a vasodilator. Nitric oxide is produced by endothelium, which is that lining of your blood vessels. So the endothelium produces nitric oxide, and that is just normal function of the endothelium is to produce nitric oxide, because that allows blood flow. Say, for example, if you have an increase of pressure in a vessel, It's like, no, I don't want that to happen. It's going to release more nitric oxide to kind of dilate the vessel so pressure's not going to be so high because it could potentially damage the vessel. Nitric oxide, though, I do have to mention, does have other functions besides being a vasodilator. It is an antioxidant. It prohibits platelets from aggregating, so it's an anti-clotting factor. And also it's anti-atherogenic agent, which decreases the production of atherosclerotic plaques, allows to keep those blood vessels nice and clean. Now, another thing that you'll notice on this is it says an increase in potassium ions. Potassium is an ion that we should see a lot higher concentration within inside the cell. And so if there's elevated levels of potassium in the tissue fluid or in the interstitium or in the blood, that's usually indicating that there's been some tissue damage, so I should say cellular damage. So this would behoove us to have more blood flow to the area where we have some damage so we can repair any potential damage. So that potassium ions are not really part of that metabolic byproduct theory, but that could be a result of cellular damage. Now, vasoconstrictors that you see here, I'm going to erase this real quick. Second. So vasoconstrictors, which we see down here, they're going to decrease flow because they increase resistance. So examples that you see is stretch, and they refer to it as a myogenic theory. So if the blood vessel gets stretched, it's an innate mechanism of vascular smooth muscle, or just smooth muscle in general, that if it's stretched, it automatically contracts. This actually allows blood flow to remain relatively constant. It's actually a form of autoregulation or self-regulation. And actually all of these examples are considered intrinsic mechanisms or examples of autoregulation. Now, a metabolic product that acts as a vasoconstrictor is endothelin. But endothelin is produced, based on the name, you can tell, it's produced by the endothelium. Again, that lining of your blood vessels. Well, that is released only if the blood vessel actually gets damaged. So if it gets cut, it helps to limit blood loss because it's going to act as a vasoconstrictor. So that is not physiologic. That is going to be more if you have any kind of damage, but it'll be still important in homeostatic regulation. Now, some examples to kind of illustrate this acute control of blood flow and the role of, say, metabolic byproducts is these couple things that you see here is hyperemia. So just look at the word hyperemia by itself. So you'll notice if you compare this picture versus this one here, the one on the right, you see a lot more distension of those vessels, more blood flow. And hyperemia is a condition where you have higher than normal levels of blood flow. Well, what's the cause of it? Well, we have two different examples. The first one is we call active hyperemia. So active hyperemia, you'll see higher than normal levels of blood flow in an organ or a tissue. And you notice it's during a period, it says here, period of increased metabolic rate. So how can we explain it based on what I've just previously discussed? Is during periods of increased metabolism, you'll be producing, say, more levels of carbon dioxide, maybe a little bit more lactic acid, requiring more oxygen. All of those would result in a relaxation of vascular smooth muscle, which would decrease resistance and increase flow. You'll notice when the period of increased metabolic rate stops, which you see right here, you'll see the blood flow will slowly go back to normal. Now, how fast it does all depends on how much metabolic byproducts were produced, because we want to pretty much wash those metabolic byproducts away. Now, another example you see here is we call reactive hyperemia. So you see increased blood flow following a period of no flow or very little flow. So what has happened? Well, during this period of time, there has been little to no blood flow. Well, the tissue's still producing carbon dioxide. It's still producing, it may be producing, if the period of blood flow was sufficient enough, you may have had to break down ATP all the way down to adenosine. We don't want to have to do that if we don't have to, because it takes a bit of time to reproduce ATP from just straight on adenosine. So those things would result in, once the blood flow has been restored, that you have that buildup of those products, you're going to have caused that vasodilation, and you'll have the increased period of increased period of increased blood flow, and to wash those products away. Once they've been removed, then you'll restore the normal level of blood flow. Now, I'm going to give you an example of active hyperemia and reactive hyperemia. Now, active hyperemia, a good example is, say, what's happening in muscles when they're being exerted, so during exercise. Another example you can see is what you see here within the brain. Certain regions of the brain are responsible for certain functions. And when you have increased metabolism in that area, it's because it's more active, you're going to see more blood flow. So with this PET scan, you'll notice where you see, start seeing yellows and greens and reds, that's indicating more flow. Where you see the black, you don't really see much flow. So for example, if you look here where it says seeing words, well, the occipital lobe is the location of your visual cortex, which is responsible for interpreting what you see, important for vision. So you see more metabolic activity in that occipital lobe. When you're hearing words, so if you look over here, the temporal lobe is where the auditory cortex is. But you're also having to interpret what you're hearing, and Wernicke's area is located in this region right over here. Speaking words, the motor cortex and Broca's area are going to be important in speaking. So you see different areas of the brain are going to light up based on its activity level. So that's just showing you active hyperemia. Now, reactive hyperemia, an example would be, say, if you go outside and it's really cold out. You'll notice that your skin's going to get really white, depending how cold it is. So you're reducing blood flow to that skin. And then you notice when you come back inside, you start getting really red, as that once it's the temperature's not as cold, but you've built up those metabolic byproducts, so the tissue, the skin gets really red as a result of it. So that's an example of, say, reactive hyperemia. Now, I did previously mention the myogenic theory, so that if you stretch vascular smooth muscle, it will constrict, and then vice versa. So I previously mentioned that. So this is just a repeat of what I just said earlier. Now, extrinsic mechanisms. So the previous ones were all intrinsic mechanisms. What are some extrinsic factors which could affect blood flow? And they're going to include the nervous system and things like hormones. So the nervous system, specifically the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, will be responsible for changes in diameter of blood vessels. The parasympathetic division doesn't innervate blood vessels, or very little, if any, blood vessels are innervated by the parasympathetic division. So we have some blood vessels that are innervated by the sympathetic division, and they release norepinephrine. So they release norepinephrine, which then binds to alpha-1 adrenergic receptors located on those vessels. Now, if that happens, that causes vasoconstriction, and that vasoconstriction would lead to a reduction in flow. Now, how can we use that to be able to increase flow? What it really always comes down to, if you can't see all these little lines, is the more sympathetic input, the increased firing rate on those blood vessels would cause vasoconstriction. If I don't want that vasoconstriction, you'll have less firing to that blood vessel. So you see kind of this less amount of firing. So firing rate decreases. So it's a less sympathetic tone. That leads to the vascular smooth muscle relaxing and vasodilation, which increases flow. So changing sympathetic input to some blood vessels could affect blood flow. And again, you're assuming the blood vessel is innervated by the autonomic nervous system. And arterioles are innervated by the sympathetic division, but precapillary sphincters and the metarterioles are not innervated by the autonomic nervous system. So those other factors, those intrinsic factors, are going to be important in altering the contractile state of the smooth muscle associated with precapillary sphincters and the metarterioles. Now, other things that could affect flow would be hormones, and all these hormones that I'm showing you right now or we'll write down, are vasoconstrictors. So they will increase resistance, which would decrease flow. And all these we have discussed previously. So the angiotensin 2, I'm going to abbreviate it like this, angiotensin 2, which is a product of the renin-angiotensin aldosterone system, is a vasoconstrictor. Is a reminder about that renin that's being produced by the kidney that converts angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1. Then angiotensin 1 is converted to angiotensin 2 by angiotensin converting enzyme. And angiotensin 2 is a very good vasoconstrictor. And this, I'm going to put a star by this, is the most important in physiologic regulation of, I should say, how do I say it? It's going to be very important in blood pressure regulation, but it's also a pretty good, important in vasoconstriction as a hormone. We're talking about hormones. Now, the adrenal medulla secretes norepinephrine and epinephrine. Most of it's epinephrine. Both of those are vasoconstrictors. Again, they're going to bind to those alpha-1 adrenergic receptors. The neurohypophysis, that posterior pituitary gland, releases ADH, but remember the other name for ADH is vasopressin because its effects on vascular smooth muscle is a very powerful vasoconstrictor. Now, a couple examples of some vasodilators. One would be histamine, which is released by mast cells, which can be found in tissues. A lot of you may, if you have a lot of allergies, you're well aware of some of the effects of histamine. And one of the things that histamine does, it is a vasodilator. And if someone has a very bad allergic reaction, it can cause a significant vasodilation, which something we'll be talking about later, can cause a significant drop in your blood pressure. But the vasodilating effects of histamine are very important in inflammation. Now, another vasodilator is going to be that nitric oxide that's produced by the endothelium. Okay, so we've previously mentioned that nitric oxide before, but that here we're talking about it again. Now, what about long-term control of blood flow? Everything else could be short-term, second to second, minute to minute change in blood flow. But what about long-term control? Well, long-term control is slow, takes some time, and really how we alter blood flow in the long term is changing the number and the size of vessels. We can produce more blood vessels via a process called angiogenesis. So that's the production of new blood vessels. Now that takes some time, and it's actually much quicker in the young than in older people. And it's also going to be very rapid in things like tumors, it's much more rapid, but the angiogenesis is actually a response to chronic hypoxia. So long term, where you're not getting enough oxygen, it's going to say, I can't deal with this anymore. I need to be able to get more oxygen. And so what happens is your body says, I need some more blood vessels, but it does take some time. Now, I want you to just think about it with when someone's training, when they start to work out. When they first start to work out, they fatigue so quickly. But as they continue to work out in response to training, they don't fatigue as quickly because you will increase capillarity to those muscles as a result of training. So it becomes much easier. Well, another example we're going to see is besides just exercise and you get this increase in capillarity is you could see this also in, like I said, rapidly or tissues or things that are increasing in size rapidly, or say uncontrolled cell growth, and you could see that with tumors. And so here is an example of a tumor that was removed from me, and the tumor is right here, and the thing is the tumor was very vascular, and so the blood vessels had wrapped itself around here, which was one of my fallopian tubes and my ovary. And so right here, this is, or was, I should say, my uterus, and the tumor was actually a cervical tumor. It was a leiomyoma, which is a smooth muscle tumor. And it grew very rapidly because it had a really good blood supply. And so tumors will grow very quickly if they've got pretty good blood supply because it's getting all the nutrients, getting all the oxygen it needs to be able to continue to grow. So tumors are also an example of where you have increased vascularity. Now, next topic for another recording, we're going to be looking at the control of blood pressure. So look for that recording a little bit later.